Imagine a room the public was never meant to see. You don't notice the clock first, you notice the contradictions. Stainless steel trays meant for lab glassware sit beside a table scattered with tarot cards and a palmistry chart smudged at the lifeline. There's a clipboard. There's also a candle someone forgot to scrape wax from. The air smells like floor polish, photocopier toner, and a little like incense someone swears they didn't light. This was the strangest equation of the Cold War. PhDs plus paperwork plus ritual. Welcome back to Mythology Lore. Today we're not asking whether magic is real. We're asking a weirder question. Can a superpower weaponize belief, and if nobody in the room believes a word of it? In the alphabet jungle of classified projects, one door had a rumor attached to it often. It wasn't the biggest, and it certainly wasn't the most successful, but it may be the most revealing. Because if you want to understand how power thinks, you don't just study what it can measure, you study what it's willing to measure. Here's the claim in plain English. Somewhere between the lab bench and the seance table, U.S. intelligence tried to map how human beings behave when belief walks into the room. That's our story. And it begins not with a spell, but with a file. To see why anyone would fund this, you have to remember what the world felt like. Rockets, spies, proxy-escher. But the scarier battlefield was inside the mind. One CIA chemist could order a beaker, another could order a medium. The goal wasn't salvation. It was influence. If you're thinking, that sounds like MKULTRA with incense, you're on the right track, but not the whole track. Occult was about chemicals, hypnosis, sensory deprivation. MK often wandered off the map, toward what you might call the theater of belief, astrologers on retainer, a sorcery class wearing an academic fig leaf, even a day trip through the United Nations with a camera and a clairvoyant. And if you think this sounds too wild to write down, someone did. In a minute, we'll step into the alphabet soup that led to this. But keep one truth handy as we go: whether or not the stars could predict anything was beside the point. The question was, what happens to people when they think the stars can? Stay with me. Because the strangest thing about MK often isn't the ritual, it's the bureaucracy. If you stack the Cold War's acronyms, you could climb them like a ladder. MKUltra, MKSearch, and, not quite a sibling, but definitely a cousin twice, Removec often. Each one asked some version of, how do we shape behavior? MKUltra is the most infamous. You've heard the greatest hits: LSD experiments, hypnosis, sensory deprivation. Much of it underdocumented because records were deliberately destroyed. A fact emphasized by journalist Stephen Kinzer when he profiled Sidney Gottlieb, the soft-spoken chemist whose day job straddled ethics like a highwire. But MK often. That's the odd cousin. Instead of only tweaking the body chemistry, it poked at the story belief. If people are ritual-shaped creatures, could Ritual 11 Fate Ritual be useful? In practice, that meant codifying the irrational. Imagine a form where you check boxes like astrological profile delivered or palm reading completed. Imagine a lab report stapled to a session log that reads like a seance transcript. Not because anyone in the room is a believer, but because someone is a collector. And there were labsage would arsenal include where chemical exposures produced confusion and delirium, the clinical echo to the chapel music down the hall. The file names look neat. The stories don't. Why would a rational agency do this? 3 reasons. Adversary modeling. If rival services lean on psychics or belief-shaped rumor, you want to know how to counter a copycat. Covercraft. Ritual can be a stage set. If you can stage a seance, you can stage anything, including a meeting people will misinterpret exactly how you want them to. Human factors. Belief is a multiplier. Add it to fear and rumor, and small signals become loud. So yes, someone in a suit once took notes while someone in beads read a palm. Not because the palm had secrets, but because the reader did. The reader is a performer, and performance is data. We're going somewhere specific with this, the United Nations, a place built for daylight diplomacy, visited by a man asked to find evil in the hallways. This next scene sounds like fiction. It wasn't. Picture the kind of tour you can't put on the brochure. A medium is escorted down bright corridors at the United Nations in New York. No candles, no cloaks, just an ordinary building and a very unordinary assignment. Raise your hand if you sense an evil personality. Is this ridiculous? Maybe. Is it risky? Absolutely. You do not smuggle mysticism into the UN and expect zero consequences if someone notices. The cameras are hidden, the instructions are simple. The result? No detections. A null test. Here's why it mattered anyway. Operational rehearsal. How do you shepherd an unconventional asset as sensitive through a hard-to-control public environment without attracting attention? You practice. Behavioral observation. How does the asset act physically? Verbally, they think they're sensing threat. How do nearby staff react to the asset? What rhythms, looks, hesitations show up on film? Cover stories under stress. What explanation holds if a guard asks questions? What's the plan B if a journalist bites? It's not that the UN is full of shadows. It's that visibility is the enemy of plausible deniability. One wrong look, one whisper to the press, and suddenly your director is explaining to a congressional committee why your budget paid a man to wave his hand at diplomats. Even a failed experiment is a data point. The walkthrough taught what the occult always teaches when you drag it into bureaucracy. If you're going to flirt with the theater of belief, you'd better be good at stage management. And that brings us to a different stage entirely, a college classroom where every stage has note-takers. Here's the paradox. If you want open inquiry, you go to a university. If you want secrecy, you absolutely do not go to a university. And yet, through a front connected to Industried Scientific Engineering Institute, money found its way to coursework in ritual practices at the Southern campus, with modules on fertility rites, initiation ceremonies, even necromancy as symbolic practice. Students and faculty approached it as anthropology or comparative religion. Somewhere else, someone read their papers like field notes. Why risk it? Because a campus gives you cover. We're just studying culture, and because a campus gives you crowds. You can observe how groups respond to ritual performance in a setting that looks safe. No uniforms, no vault doors, just a syllabus. But campuses leave paper trails, course catalogs, receipts, memos, the very things a director hates reading in a newspaper. The longer the course runs, the higher the odds that curiosity becomes a story. This is the tension that eventually snapped the thread. When you blend lab logic with ritual theater, you get footnotes, and footnotes can be subpoenaed. That's exactly the climate in which a short, blunt order hit the system like a curse. Read, destroy. If you want to understand how a bureaucracy thinks, follow the invoices. One of the strangest line items of the era reads almost like a prank. Astrologers on salary about $300 a week plus travel. It wasn't a fortune, but it wasn't theater money either. What exactly are you buying when you put a stargazer on payroll? You're not buying the stars. You're buying the performaticant, confidence, the choreography of expertise. In a secure room, a reader lays out charts and speaks in that curious blend of certainty and metaphor. Mars rising delays, aggression, friction. Inside the mind of a good case officer. This is less prophecy than pattern. Which phrasing makes people lean forward? Which metaphor convinces an educated person to hesitate before signing a cable? Who in the room nods, who rolls their eyes, and who changes their weekend plan? When one San Francisco figure was unmasked as a fraud and still paid, the press would have called it incompetence. But within the walls, there's a colder possibility. Fraud is a laboratory. A known fraudster is perversely, a controlled variable. You can measure who believes them, when, and why. You can test whether a fabricated frame, your lifeline, shows travel risk this quarter nudges choices on the margins. You can observe organizational susceptibility soft spots where theater slips into planning. And this isn't unique to horoscopes. The Cold War mind games often turned on presentation, not proof. MKULTRAS broader pattern documented in mainstream retrospectives and public conversations decades later wasn't to authenticate mysticism, but to poke every possible lever by which perception becomes behavior. That record destruction culture we mentioned, it grew partly out of the recognition that even testing these levers looked indefensible in daylight. So yes, a bureaucratic brain could rationalize a fraud budget. The logic, questionable as it is, goes like this: if belief is a weapon, then believability is ammunition. Measure it, catalog it, then hope nobody ever asks why tarot appears next to travel expense. But you only understand the stakes when you leave the conference room and visit the places where this logic touched real lives, places with one-way mirrors, hospital wards, and soldiers who thought they were volunteering for routine research. San Francisco, a safe house with the curtains drawn. There's a table, a bed, and a mirror that looks like a mirror until you stand at the wrong angle. On the other side, a pair of watchers jot down times and reactions. The guest, unwitting. The LSD, unannounced. This was Operation Midnight Climax, a name that sounds like a pulp paperback and feels like a confession. It weaponized setting as much as chemical sex, secrecy, suggestion, turning a city's underbelly into a chalkboard for behavior. The justification was national security. The impact was human and lasting. Decades later, popular summaries still underline how the CIA used brothel fronts in San Francisco and New York to dose and observe civilians, cementing the city's eerie tie to that chapter of drug culture. Edgewood Arsenal, a chair with straps and clipboards nearby. Not every test involved theatrical ambience. Some were brutal in their plainness. Volunteers, often young soldiers, were exposed to incapacitating agents that produced delirium, confusion, and shattered continuity. A crisp form would log onset, duration, residual effects. What a form could not log was the way a person looks when they realize their mind has been scrambled by order, and that the people responsible call this data. The detail that keeps historians gnawing is a 1973 entry reflecting human exposure tests while the occult branch was supposedly killed in 1972. A bureaucratic hydra where one head burns while another keeps biting. This split heater shuttered. Chemistry lingering haunts the record. Montreal, a hospital room with a tape loop that never stops. Patients of psychiatrist Ewan Cameron with CIA support in the background and sensory deprivation, extreme electroconvulsive therapy, and psychic driving, recorded messages played on repeat. It wasn't a cult. It was institutional audacity wearing a lab coat and a grant number. Survivors described memory damage, lost identity, and an afterward that kept echoing long after the funding dried up. What ties these rooms together isn't any belief in magic. It's a belief in control, that if you can nudge chemistry, environment, or narrative, you can place a finger on human choice. Public-facing reflections and book tour years later would stress how an entire culture of experimentation, filtered through fear and secrecy, invited abuses and then shredded the receipts. That pattern is essential context for any conversation about MK Orphan's oddities. Now that we've walked through the rooms, let's talk about why anyone thought these rooms were strategic. If your adversary believes in omens, do you learn the omens or learn the people who believe them? If rumor travels faster than tanks, do you invest in tanks or rumor? The Cold War was an arms race of frames. Not just rockets, but reasons. Not just weapons, but worldviews. In that world, It becomes think-a-blife, not wizardo test anything that bends perception, drugs that loosen the anchor, environments that script reactions, rituals that confer meaning where none exists. To a planner, ritual is not sacred. It's tooling, outfits, symbols, a timetable of touches that produce certainty in the user. Whether it's a colonel swearing on a manual or a medium tracing a line on a palm, the nervous system calms when the script is familiar. That calm is exploitable. So is fear. Public conversations with researchers and journalists decades later often describe Mythology not simply as a deranged outlier, but as a project fundamentally aimed at weaponizing altered states and the stories we tell about them, a way to probe how the mind might be steered, whether by a substance, a signal, or a story. That framing helps explain why a cousin program could drift into belief as data without anyone in the chain having to believe in crystal balls. This is the sharp edge. If belief steers behavior, then analyzing believability is strategy. The risk, of course, is that in treating people like instruments, you become the instrument laid by arrogance, tuned by secrecy, and ultimately audited by daylight. Daylight arrived on New Year's Eve, 1972, as a memo. The best-known line in this shadow story is the shortest: read, destroy. It lands like the last two words in a spellbanishing, irrevocable, tidy. But anyone who has ever cleaned a garage knows a two-word command can take years to finish. On December 31, 1972, CIA Director Richard Helms reportedly ordered the program's occult wing to die on paper and, wherever possible, in reality. The rationale floated phrases like moral and ethical considerations alongside sensitive security issues. Translated, that reads, "This can't survive discovery." It wasn't just the risk of confirming witches at the Pentagon. It was the broader pattern, the same culture that let Mythology stretch, shred, and shrug, finally seeing the mirror. As reporters and authors later emphasized, record destruction was a deliberate choice of that ecosystem, not an accident of storage. And yet, like a magic trick you can't explain, even after being told, a 1973 fragment out of Edgewood shows human exposure tests continuing under the broader label. That contradiction has a mundane explanation. Programs bifurcate. The theater dies, the lab limps on, the paperwork, never fully obedient, leaves a breadcrumb you can find half a century later. To critics, it's damning. To insiders, it's normal. Either way, the lesson is the same. When you rely on secrecy to save you from your own decisions, you become vulnerable to the one thing secrecy cannot defeat: time. You can cut off a head. You cannot easily kill an impulse. The occult-tinged branch of MK often could be zeroed out with a memo. The clinical impulsive urge to test, tweak, and tally the mind had roots in other budgets and buildings. If laboratories could promise actionable outputs, X milligrams causes Y behavior, they would tend to survive, even while anything smelling of robes and ritual was tossed into a burn bag. But the impulse underneath both branches was the same: control in the gray zones of perception. That's why the whole era produces stories that sound unrelated: an LSD brothel here, a star chart there, a tape loop in a hospital, and yet they rhyme. They rhyme because they spring from the conviction that the mind is hardware and humanity is software. And if you get the right coder, chemical, cultural, or symbolic, you can rewrite the machine. Years later, popular interviews and summaries would revisit Mythology with a mixture of outrage and fascination. The chemist with monk-like habits who authorized monstrous tests. The musician or author who crossed paths with a program and turned that encounter into counterculture. The rumor that never fully dies because the files never fully lived. The most enduring detail isn't a single experiment. It's the institutional willingness to try anything that might work and then to protect the institution from the non-trivial cost of being seen. By now you can feel the outline of the true occult here. It's not necromancy. The darkest magic in this story is credulity with a budget, the belief that ends absolve means, and that the damage of just testing things is less than the damage of leaving a lever unpulled. The whole edifice relied on one incantation. No one will ever find out. It was repeated in small rooms while forms were stamped and courses were funded and sensitives were walked through hallways under hidden lenses. But power doesn't have to believe in magic to be warped by it. Bring ritual into the building as a study subject, and you risk making ritual of your own. The monthly brief, the euphemism, the burn bag. Before long, the very act of destroying records becomes a rite performed in the name of credibility, at the cost of it. Histories and interviews that revisit MKULTRES its scope, its ethics, its shredded paper trail underlined this paradox over and over. So here's the clear lesson for us. Guardrails aren't enemies of security. They are the only kind that lasts. A state that plays with perception must be transparent about its limits, or it will end up experimenting on its own legitimacy. In a world where belief moves markets, elections, and everyday choices, we can't afford to be naive about how stories steer you, and we can't afford to let institutions write stories they're unwilling to read out loud.